welcome back to another episode. Before we get started, I just wanted to invite you to our first ever community golf event on May 3rd in Avon, New York at Farview Golf Course. It is a 4-person scramble, 18-hole event with prizes, raffles, lunch, and dinner included. Plus, some proceeds will go to Active Minds, a non-for-profit who supports teen and child mental health. But that's not all. Make Mental and Humble NYC are launching a special mental health fitness clothing collaboration on the day of the event. Spaces are limited and are filling fast, so please check the link in the description below to sign up. If you would like to donate or purchase some of the clothing but can't make it to the event, please reach out to makementalsales@gmail.com. Help us make a difference together. Let me tell you about the Sleep With Me podcast. If you struggle to get a good night's sleep like me, I need you to check out this podcast. Each episode is crafted to help you unwind, featuring gentle storytelling designed to ease your mind and guide you into restful slumber. I kid you not, whenever I'm anxious in bed at night, I turn it on, and before I know it, it's morning, and I'm as refreshed as I've ever been. I am not sure how it works, but trust me when I tell you, it does. So, join me and thousands of others who have turned restless nights into peaceful sleep with the help of the Sleep With Me podcast. Go Global is a free-flowing technology company that handcrafts, embellishes, and manufactures garments and accessories. Designed on the principles of people, places, and possibilities, Go Global reimagines fashion and is inspired by you, the people of the world. Hello again, beautiful people. Welcome back to yet another episode on the Make Mental podcast. I'm going to say it every time, another special guest here, and I'm personally excited for this one because of her connection now to the soccer world, which we will dive into. But we have Dr. Brooke Choulet on the podcast with us today. Dr. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll give the listeners a brief introduction here, and then I always ask the guests to introduce themselves because my elevator pitch is not nearly ever as impressive as their own. So I will just do a brief introduction here, and then the floor is yours. So Brooke is a performance psychiatrist that specializes in optimizing the mental health of everyone from high-pressure athletes to people that are in day-to-day high-performance environments, corporate executives, musicians, artists, and sometimes even their family. So I think that is very interesting. She believes that if you require peak mental performance in your personal and professional life, that her psychiatry can help you. So she's done it now for a number of professional sports teams. She's been a consultant or a concierge psychiatrist for them. And she's really a thought leader in her industry. She's really pushing the narrative there. So like I said, that's a little bit from my perspective about her, but I will open up the floor here in the beginning to you, Brooke, to kind of fill in the massive gaps that I clearly just left there. So if you could do that for us, that would be awesome.
Sure, thank you. So I am trained in adult, child, and adolescent psychiatry. So I did 5 years of training after medical school to be able to see IC ages 5+, which is really cool to work with kids in youth sports all the way through professional. And then my career kind of evolved in initially starting a concierge group practice where I have 5 psychiatrists, 5 psychologists, and a therapist. And now really diving into more of the advocacy space, writing for platforms like Forbes, Psychology Today, and then doing a lot of national speaking, advocating for high quality mental health resources in sports because a lot of organizations, I actually just put out an article today on Sports Business Journal about it, treat mental health services as kind of like a checkbox that they have to check as a requirement and not necessarily see the true value that it could have. So I see my role as really pushing the narrative and discussing the importance of high quality mental health services and how that will translate on the quarter field to better performance.
Yeah, and I think it is beautiful, right? That they have most organizations have a resource available, but in my opinion, we're beyond check the box, right? We know mental health is important. We know that a lot of performance, whether it's physical or mental, depending on what your occupation requires, is so heavily on your mental well being. So I don't think it's a hot take for me to say that we're past check the box. I think it's important that we still make note of that, but I really appreciate what you do in the sense of, yeah, we'll be here, we'll provide what your organization needs, but we're going to do so
Mhm.
much more for you because that's just who we are. As we get into this, can you quickly go over the differences between all the, I like to call it alphabet soup if you're not in the mental health space, between the
Right.
psychiatry, the psychology, and therapy, because I know there are three different distinct occupations.
Yes, and now on top of that, adding on CMPCs, which are certified mental performance coaches or consultants. So that's kind of the fourth added layer that's really solely focused on enhancing mental performance, really kind of like on court or on field skills. And then you have therapists who can obviously they could do a better job describing themselves, but essentially it's a like in our state, it's an LPC, so a licensed professional counselor, or an LMFT, licensed marriage family therapist, someone that's gone through, their bachelor's and master's degree and has clinical counseling experience. And then the next level is clinical psychologists, which have a PsyD or a PhD and complete a postdoc and doctorate school to get a degree in psychology, a doctorate in psychology. And then an MD or DO is a medical physician who's able to prescribe medication and do various types of therapy.
Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown because I'm just going to go full of hot takes, I guess, today. Geez. I call them social media therapists, and there's nothing wrong, right, with
Mhm.
seeking, I would say, base level advice from that, right? Understanding that you might be struggling and they're there to help you, right? Even my platform, I don't have any of those letters, so I can't say you shouldn't take what we put out there with some sort of value. But once you're serious enough to take that next step, I think it is so important to look at their credentials, make sure they've had experience because you're trusting them with an important part of your life, right?
Mhm.
Like I said, I think us social therapists, I'll just throw myself in that group, not to offend anyone, have our purpose. But when you're ready to take that serious next step, those letters, those hard-earned letters at the beginning and end of your name really go a long way when you're trying to take care of yourself, right? For you, I guess, what made you pursue psychiatry? Was that something you always wanted to do, or did it kind of fall in your lap one?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my mom and my grandpa are both child and adolescent psychiatrists as well. So it was kind of in the blood. They still encouraged me to go to medical school and choose whatever specialty I felt most called to. But for me, it was psychiatry. And what was most unique is that all three of us did something totally different in psychiatry. So my grandpa did juvenile detention work, academic psychiatry, did a lot of research. My mom did solo private practice her whole life. And then I kind of was this odd sheep in the family where I'm like, I'm going to start a group practice and I'm going to build a business and do something really different than what either of them had done. So it's cool that we all did psychiatry, but in such different ways too.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I particularly have an interest in like the adolescent piece. I think you said was that your grandfather?
Yeah, both of them see adolescents too.
Okay. We had a gentleman on, Michael Fenskin. He's at UNLV, Nevada, for his clinical on adolescent absenteeism and how you can
Mm.
reduce that. So there's got to be some overlap there. I'd be probably curious to talk to them now, but we'll focus on you. You specifically, when you focus on high performing athletes or CEOs or industry leaders, right? Do you approach them the same way you would approach someone, say, like me, right? Someone who is emerging, is still ambitious, but doesn't necessarily go through the same day to day stressors that they have.
It's challenging. I try and take the lead of the patient. So if someone calls me and sometimes I get a high achieving executive who's like, I'm doing totally fine, but I have this one very focused problem that I need your help on. So in those cases, I approach that differently when they're kind of giving me that warning shot of like, hey, I'm looking forward to seeing you, but I really just need to focus on this one thing and work through that. And maybe we have just a few sessions. And then everyone else, general mental health, sports psychiatry, performance psychiatry, I approach that first visit the same for everyone. I really want a good understanding of who they are, like how they're supported in their lives, who they have to support, what their work structure looks like. Because whether you're an athlete or a high functioning professional, you have some sort of a work structure. What are the dynamics like? What are your strengths? How do you communicate? All those things we dive into. And I do this kind of audit of their whole life, really uncovering what makes them happy and then what causes them stress too.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because the deeper you go into the mental health space, the more and more you figure out that blanket approaches to handling situations don't always work because we are so different, even though the stress is the same, right? You're still
Mhm.
experiencing that emotion or that strong feeling, I would say. The reasons why they happen to each individual are so different that you can't just, for lack of better terms, throw a blanket over them and it covers every single client, every single individual. With that in mind, are there things that someone listening to this episode right now they could say, "Hey, I have baseline stress," right? I'm not going to define what that means for each person, but
Mhm.
they wake up in the morning and they have some sort of anxiety level. They might not be sure why. Is there something that they could do to kind of do a quick audit, as you put it, of their own life during the day, just to figure out if it's something that maybe they need a workout and it will go away, or maybe they're really nervous because they just got a car payment. Is there something they could audit to figure out, maybe without taking that next step right now? It might turn into that, but like, hey, take a deep breath, it will be okay.
That's such a tough one because that's like a whole podcast in it of itself, right? So that's kind of my approach and methodology in session. And what I would say though is the starting point for everyone is I truly say take an audit of everything you do in your week. What do you not like? What could you delegate using kind of the Eisenhower matrix? What lights you up? What doesn't bring you kind of passion? And figure out what you can delegate, what you can offload, what you can make more efficient so that you have time to do these things that bring you joy. Because that's the first thing I hear from people is when I'm like, oh, go work out or go meet up for lunch with a friend. They're like, well, I don't have time for that. And I'm like, well, let's make time. Do you feel like your schedule's running you or are you running your schedule? And when you can make that shift to taking control over your day, it's a profound effect on your day to day life.
1000%. And if you're okay with that, I'd like to spend some time here, maybe just kind of enlightening people what the Eisenhower metric is. But before we get to that point, I've been doing a lot of reading in the new year. It's one
Mhm.
of those things, like you mentioned, I have to make time for, right? Because it did
Yeah.
slip away. I mean, I'm 25, so I'm at that point where like I still enjoy playing video games, but I'm starting to
Mhm.
no longer see the value in that, right? Not that, again, personal choice. Some people could say the opposite, right? Maybe they spent their entire childhood reading and now they want the freedom to play video games. You have to take that audit and figure out what's good for you. But I've been reading 10% Happier by Dan
Mhm.
Harris. On my way here to Nashville, I'm recording from Nashville, out of my usual spot for those people that follow me. I listen to Think Like a Monk by Jay Shetty, so I still listen to
It's a
these
great one.
these thought leaders, and they bring up some version of this audit, making time for specific things in your life. I think Dan Harris said people will spend 1,005. Actually, I think it was Jay Shetty, maybe both. They said people spend so much money on coffee, right? But when they go to spend $30 a month on a gym membership, it's too expensive.
Mhm.
So I don't know if this metrics. I mean, I know what the Eisenhower metrics is, but or matrix, excuse me. How can we use this four box approach to our audit?
Yeah, so jotting down a list of everything you have to do in a week, whether it's work out or take care of your child or do meetings, see patients, whatever it is, and then you bucket it into one of these four quadrants. So on the top matrix, you could think of like urgent or not urgent, and on the far right, you think of important or non-important. And then based on if it's like any combination of those four, you then, for example, if it's urgent and important, that's in the do quadrant and you have to do that. And then in the delete quadrant would be the not important and not urgent. So, really thinking through your tasks, is there an easier way to do them? For example, I had someone I was seeing that was just spending hours just trying to figure out how to like scan in their receipts and this and that for tracking expenses. I'm like, why aren't you delegating that? You are
Mm.
making way too much money and running too large of a company to be doing that on your own. So things like that that can really offload people's time so then they can prioritize things that A, either make them happier or B, it's something that's making them money and is quite urgent to do.
Yeah, and I think each individual has to define urgency versus importance, right? Because we
Hmm.
often mistake that. And I know in the matrix itself, that box in the top left, the important and urgent, is that crisis mode. And we often spend a lot of time in either that crisis mode or the one just to the side, right? The one that's not so important, but those day-to-day
Hmm.
tasks that you have to skin in your receipts, right? If we can take certain percentages of those after our audit, our individual audit, and move it down to the bottom left to that super important but maybe not necessarily urgent, that for me, reading, for others, playing
Hmm.
video games. I'm sure for you, continuing to work on your psychiatry and your public speaking now, that's cool. We'll get into that too. It is, I will sit here and play devil's advocate because I say I want to do it, I say
Hmm.
I've done it, which I have, but it does take a lot of effort. In your opinion, or if I guess in the past, if people have come to you and say, like, Brooke, I know I should be doing this, it is just too hard,
Hmm.
where's the first place they should start?
Yeah, I like the bite-sized actionable steps because it's like the New Year's resolution where you come from working out 0 days a week to I'm going to work out 5 days a week. It's like that's not sustainable. And although you may be able to keep it up for 2 weeks, I want to see you have lasting success. So thinking about how can you make something attainable and sustainable is important, and then tailoring the plan to such, right? Actually creating action steps. The other person, entrepreneur who says, I want to start a company. That's great, but what steps do you need to take between now and starting a company to get there? You have to open a bank account, talk to an attorney, create a corporation structure, all these things. So while it's great for people to have these goals, goals are really just dreams unless you do something about it.
Yeah, and I appreciate the perspective of outside athletics as well, the creating company. Because when I started this, I was trying to decide between non for profit, LLC, like all
Hmm.
these things you don't know about. So as you start taking those bite sized steps, I guess the small attainable approach, you you start to find the joy in it. You start to have fun with it, even though it's a different type of stress, right? Stress isn't going to go away. You can just
Hmm.
choose your stress or let the stress choose you, is how I like to put it. But for you, and I'm going to go back to athletics for a second, but feel free to steer it wherever you want. When you work with, say, super high performing athletes, professional athletes, is there one thing that you see that they come to you the most? Is it, how do I handle the media? Is it, oh my gosh, I'm not playing now under a new coach. How do I deal with this? Is it, I'm not 25 anymore. I really have to work hard to take care of my body. Is there one thing, or maybe two, that you notice the most that these professional athletes come to you with that they're really struggling with? Right?
I think the first one that comes to mind is self-esteem and low self-confidence, and really experiencing some variation of levels of imposter syndrome, not feeling good enough, not feeling like they're getting enough playing time. All these things that really result in negative self-talk is definitely one of them. And then the other big one too is a lot of athletes feel like setting boundaries with their families is mean, but then what ends up happening when they don't set boundaries is that they're enabling further bad behavior, or they're just enabling people to continue to take advantage of them, leading to increased expectations, leading to never making anyone happy around them. And I see that as a huge problem as well. So a lot of our work is really giving them the permission to say no and to understand that setting that boundary is not being mean, but keeping themselves psychologically safe.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, athletics as a occupation in itself, right? You're playing a game, but at the same time, that's how you make a living, right? So setting that boundary with your family, it's got to be so difficult. And then on the flip side, the families potentially, again, I'm going to make an assumption, assume that they're already being flexible, right? By letting this athlete go to these practices, go to this film session, eat healthy, tailor their every single second of their day around their job. I like to look at it from this lens. A regular 9 to 5 kind of does the same thing, right? You can't eat dinner before 5 o'clock, not that you would anyway, but you don't have a choice. You have to go to bed on time so you can get up the next morning. So is it really that much of a difference? I'm curious to you, is professional sports, in your opinion, that much different from, say, a 9 to 5?
It's similar in the essence that you have dynamics, right? Relationship dynamics like you would at work. But here it's like with your coaches or teammates or people around you, that ecosystem of like athletic trainers, everyone around you. So in that regard, it's very similar. But it's very hard in professional sports to be able to detach like you can in a working environment like an office, right? Because you could physically walk through the door of your office and you're like, okay, I'm at work. And then you could physically leave and like, okay, I'm going to listen to a podcast in the car. But take a road trip, for example, you're at the practice facility in the morning, you drive to the airport, get on the plane, go have a team dinner, go to your hotel room. Like, not once in the day do you get any separation from work. Because even though it looks different, you're not confined to a cubicle or boardroom. You're in this working environment that becomes very enmeshed and entangled because it's now becoming like a family, or it's becoming your inner circle, or maybe you're unhappy in that family unit. So it's really difficult to create separation when so much of your life in season is your sport.
Yeah, I mean, as a former college athlete now myself, I understand that, and I don't know if for any reason I performed better at away games. I think it's because I only had to focus on that one thing. There was no other tasks that I needed, but I always noticed I was so drained when I got back home. I used up all my energy, and I had 10% left. So then when I came home to my housemates or my girlfriend, it was like, I'm sorry, you only have 10% left for me, but I'm toasted. Switching away from that, however, into like, I guess, college athletics or high school athletics, those athletes and those, I guess, semi professionals, they don't get as much media exposure, right? A lot of them don't have husbands, wives, significant others to
Mhm.
respond to. Some have families, but it's more so about themselves in that respect of, can I earn playtime? Can I get good grades? Can I be a good family member if you live with your parents, if you're going down to high school? What's the switch over there from your standpoint? I know obviously from the athlete standpoint, like I said, the stresses are different, even though they're just as real. When you
Mhm.
sit down to talk with them, it's not how they make a living. Well, I guess in college it could be now, but
And now it can be.
we won't get that deep if we don't have time for it. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, when you sit down to talk to someone who's younger, still
Mhm.
developing their mind, especially, how is that approached?
There, at times, the first thing that comes to mind is there can be a tremendous amount of guilt. So let's say you're in college or in high school sports, and it's like maybe you're realizing you don't love the sport as much as you did. You don't want to play it professionally, but you're like, oh my God, my family's invested so much time and money into me training to get to this level, right? And then there's this really difficult decision to have to make where it's like, okay, I really love this and enjoy doing it for fun, but now it's not really fun. And I feel like I'm letting those down around me. Then for the people that want to continue in their sport, there's oftentimes a lot of pressure on the other end of like, my family's expecting me to go pro. I need to support my family. They put so much money into me that I need to give it back in the future. So I think from both ends, it can be really challenging and a time of really developing your own self identity. Because in middle school, your parents, maybe choose your sport for you or put you into sports, take you to practice, and there's this lack of control because they're driving you and taking you around and signing you up for things. And when you move to high school and college, it's really the first time that you can make some of these decisions on your own. And
Mhm.
that can be a big challenge as well when then that guilt creeps in and you're like, I just feel like there's this pressure to do this sport, but I don't really want to.
Yeah, and I've never really felt or heard it described as guilt before, so I appreciate that perspective. It's always really not talked about, right? You just wake up one day and you feel like you don't want to play it, but you're like, what the heck? There's only 4 more years left.
Mhm.
Might as well just suffer through it. And I mean, you still like, it's not that you fall out of friendships necessarily. You like the people you're playing the game with. It's just the stress and the time commitment. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a plethora of reasons. What would you say to the athlete who wants to play but is no longer finding joy in playing?
Yeah, that's a tough one because you really have to dive into why. And sometimes they don't know why right off the bat. It could be clinical depression, right? Because one symptom of clinical depression is that you lose interest in things that you used to enjoy. Another thing is it could be difficulty with teammates or coaches. There could be some kind of challenge or issue going on, perhaps even some type of abuse happening in the sport. So really diving in, getting to establish good rapport with the person and really diving into their why and what changed and getting a good understanding of the timeline can be helpful, and kind of getting some other opinions too, like maybe talking to parents, seeing if they've noticed any changes. But that definitely happens, and a lot of times it happens after injury because someone
Mhm.
gets injured. They're like, oh, I'm never going to play as well again, so why even bother?
Again, so many different approaches to that question. I appreciate that because there's always a starting point, right? When you get a job, you go through a training. It's kind of similar if you want to kind of rationalize it that way. You don't just, okay, here you go, start your job, right? You go through the training,
Right.
but then depending on your specialization, you need these skills, you need these skills, you need
Hmm.
different things. If you look at mental health from that standpoint, at least in my opinion, it makes it much less daunting, right? It's like, okay, yeah, I'm stepping into a new job, if you will.
Hmm.
I'm stepping into a new world that I've never been into, or if I have, maybe it was a totally different aspect, but we're going to approach it the same way. We're going to say, okay, let's be honest with this person who's trying to help me, truly honest, know that they're here to help me. And then once we
Hmm.
start to narrow down, again, which field you're in, which mental health, I guess, category that best describes your current situation, that's when the true work and the growth and the
Hmm.
freedom really begins. Because even if you end up not wanting to play and you genuinely find out why, it's that peace that you can have with yourself, right? And then you can, once you have that, you can have the more difficult conversations with your family members or your parents if you're
Hmm.
feeling that guilt, with your coach, with your teammates, with yourself. Most importantly, you can be honest with yourself. And I think that's the hardest part because we walk around every day trying to, especially when there's social media and cameras everywhere, put our best version forward for
Yeah.
everyone else, right? It's, oh, I need to look good. So it looks good for my family. So it looks good for my
Hmm.
work. So it looks good online, that you forget to truly look good for yourself, right?
Hmm.
Go look good for yourself. And it sounds so silly, but we all forget it. A few more questions for you just in the mental health sport world, and then I'll kind of open up the floor and we'll, I guess, get a little bit broader. But a lot of the community has requested that I ask someone with credentials, when you're an athlete, right, and you are now finished and you no longer have the sport, have you worked with anyone there, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really tough time for a lot of people.
Mm,
So when people are healthy and still in their sport, we talk about prevention. So I interviewed Danica Patrick, and she said that the best thing she did was start a bunch of companies while she was still racing, right? And so then when she was done, it was hard, it was an adjustment, but she had purpose. She had other things
mm,
she was working on. And that's really what I talk to my athletes about is, what are you doing now that's setting you up to have this life outside of sport? And I give the analogy of a pie with 8 slices. And I'm like, how many slices of that pie is sport in your life? And if they're like, oh, well, it's 6 to 8 of the slices, I'm like, that's the problem. I'm glad you're doing well. I'm glad you're happy. I'm glad you're healthy. But we need to work in some other slices so that you have some other purpose in life. Because once you're done with your sport, all of that, those slices are going to be ripped away from you and you're going to be left with nothing. So having those conversations preventatively rather than after the fact, if it can be done, is really helpful.
yeah, and I think for a lot of people in their mid 20s, early 30s, as bad and unfortunate and unforeseen as it was, COVID provided that opportunity. I know,
Hmm.
at least for me, when I was in college athletics, I was forced, because I literally caught COVID, to spend 2 weeks by myself and figure out what the
Yeah.
heck I liked, right? And like I said earlier, it was video games and reading, but I did start a company. So I always say COVID for me was a blessing in disguise. And I know I say that lightly because it had a very strong effect on so many people across the world. But for me, I was lucky enough to make it through and start this platform and do something
Hmm.
good with that knowledge that I gained of myself, because I realized I had two older brothers as well. I saw their sport end at some point.
Hmm.
Even one went on to play semi-professional, but even so, like it's different. It's a different relationship with the sport.
Hmm.
It's a different time commitment on top of your work. So I was lucky enough to see it before the narrative became personal. And I think, if you're right, if you can do that preventative work, and preventative not in a negative way. I think a lot of times you hear the word preventative is negative. It's more, it's preparation, right? Why would you, like you said, run out of slices of pie? Pie is delicious. Make sure you get every flavor possible. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate it because a lot of our community is in this space right now where maybe they're regretting that they didn't do more of that preparation, that preventative work,
Hmm.
but you still have time. You still have time. And you
You
know what
do.
you like deep down. It's just about getting honest with yourself, getting comfortable with yourself, and really learning how to just be with yourself. Because, like I said, our schedules, our days, everything revolves around our sport. Or again, if you're in a club, right? If you're really good in a club, it revolves around what that club is doing. It's all set for you. And even some athletes, their schedule, they don't get to choose their class schedule. It's just this is when practice is, pick classes around it. I'm sorry. What, last question in this space, what would you do? Or maybe you have personal experience. I don't, have you played sports?
I have, but not at any sort of a professional
Okay.
level.
But so you know the free time though that comes after you're done playing sports. It's more than you think. What is that first step someone could take if they haven't already done that preventative work to say, "Hey, what other flavors of pie do I like?"
Yeah, that's such a good question because I use the analogy of the bullet train in Japan, how it's like going so fast and then all of a sudden it comes to a stop at a station. That's how people feel after a season ends. They're like,
Mm.
what am I supposed to do now? This is weird. I almost feel depressed because I'm used to having this routine and this cycle. And it's this battle of like, well, what do I do? Is this okay? Am I being lazy? Am I okay to sleep in? And it's this like almost like mid-year crisis every year of like what to do now. And that's a really good thing to talk to people about is like, what else do you plan to do postseason? So you're in season, things are going great, but let's talk about what you're going to do postseason and giving yourself the space to take a break.
Yeah, might I suggest that's your bite size approach, right? It makes it less scary when you've done it for 25 years if you're playing into your
Hmm.
30s. So then when your sport does come to an end, or your club, your occupation, right? Whatever that next step in your life is, you've already practiced it 25 times. Now you
Yeah.
just have to figure out what to do for the next X amount of years instead of months, right? It's just a
Hmm.
longer time difference, but that first step is usually pretty similar. And if you've already had 25 reps in it, all right, let's go. Here's number 26. And if you don't like it, here's number 27. That's the beauty in it too, right? You get the choice now. Even if you chose to do what you were doing before, you get a brand new choice. And it's quite limitless. But I appreciate your perspective there on season by season rather than, oh no, I have 4 years left. It's like, no, you have 3 months and then you got to figure out what to
Hmm.
do for the other nine, right? If you're in
Right.
college, it doesn't last that long. I want to move to one more spot and then I'll open up the floor to you and we'll
Hmm.
get into the last question that I know everyone
Yeah.
loves. Um, I am a coach now after playing, and it is a totally different ballgame mentally
Hmm.
because you can empathize if you've played with these athletes. You still want the best out of them, so you're going to push them, right? But you have to be careful. You can't push them to the point of injury, exhaustion, just mental disruption. That takes a toll on a coach who then, not in my case, but in a lot of cases, they have a family to go home to because
Hmm.
it is their job, right? This is a tricky world to be in because you really care about them, but you also know that some athletes can give more. How would you approach a coach maybe as a doctor and say like, "Hey, look, you are very important in their life, but you don't have to be at all," because I think coaches feel like they have to be everything for their athletes.
Hmm. I love using observation statements, like in any and all situations. And so, what I mean by that is really removing emotion from something, not being emotionally charged, but just making a statement and opening up the floor for someone to feel comfortable to answer. So,
Hmm.
it could be something like, hey, I've noticed X, Y, and Z. Have you noticed that too? Or I found it interesting when this happened. What was your intention? What did you think of that? Using statements like that can really help set the tone for a non judgmental conversation. The person doesn't feel like they're being attacked or criticized, but really allows them to come to the table with their own thoughts. It's like casting a really wide net instead of saying to your child, did you have a good day at school? Yes or no. It's like, hey, how was your day at school?
Hmm.
It's like, opening up for more dialogue. So I think with coaches, whether it's me talking to a coach or a coach talking to their athletes, using that non-judgmental but observational type of statements is going to go much further.
Yeah, and I think that helps. You're right. The athlete want to respond because then I know a big
Mhm.
fear is, oh, if I answer this, they're not going to play me because they're not going to think I'm mentally ready. Athletes are tremendously good at compartmentalization when it comes to game time, right? There
Right.
have been so many times where I've been upset that I didn't do as well on a test, or maybe I got in an argument with a friend, or shoot, I was supposed to call grandma, like something like that, for the first 20 seconds of the game, and then nothing but the game is on my mind, right?
Hmm.
Not even the last mistake I made. And then after the game, it all comes rushing back in. So I think if we start to structure those questions that way as coaches, you're right. It invites them to answer honestly. It'll create a more welcoming environment, and your team will, in theory, start to see more success because you're more comfortable. You get to know each other better. I mean, you spend so much time, anyways. As a coach, sometimes we're the first line of defense. That
Hmm.
comes with its own set of pressures again, right? I know we sign up for it, I know we get paid for it, but it's something that until you need to be that first line of defense, you really, really don't think about it. Is
Hmm.
there coursework or is there something that coaches can turn to in the event where, I mean, anywhere from worst case scenario, maybe I'll throw out a quick trigger warning here for any of the listeners. A suicide mention or thought comes up from one of their athletes, or severe depression. Is there something that the
Hmm.
coach can do to de-escalate the situation and truly get that athlete the help they deserve?
Yeah, I mean, this is a plug for having mental health services integrated, right? Is that at the beginning of the season, one of the jobs is to write the mental health emergency action plan so that if, God forbid, the time comes, it isn't a what should I do now? It's let's pull out the plan and move through these steps
Mm,
because coaches have so many other things to worry about. The last thing they should have to worry about is coming up with that emergency action plan on their own in real time. So that is something to consider is really making sure that coaches are well equipped. And I think that comes with bringing in experts. Like I just spoke at the Phoenix Rising staff performance program. So bringing in a professional to speak at some of these coach development programs can be helpful. And having someone, even if it's just a one-time advisor, to come in and help create that mental health emergency action plan so the team is prepared should that happen.
I like that. I like that a lot. And it's going to take a lot more work for every institution, whether that's a college, whether that's a professional, whether it's a
Mhm.
company, right? A business. Stress is stress. It doesn't matter if you're sitting at a desk doing a spreadsheet or shooting a free throw, right? At, I guess, I know you just brought up one area you just did a mental health speech at, or probably a highly purposeful speech, right? There was probably something they need you to talk about. Where can someone find you if they're like, hey, we didn't think about this. We need someone to come talk to our school. Where can they find you and what types of keynote speeches do you give? What is your specialty?
Yeah, so people could find me through my website, and people are always shocked to hear that the email and the phone number listed on there are my direct lines. Like you could contact me and get a hold of me. So brookchouletmd.com. And then typically I'll do talks on like introduction to sports psychiatry, the science behind peak performance and how to apply that in a professional or an athletic environment. Really, I'll do talks on anything that people need, resilience training, mindset training, talks for coaches, mental health emergency action planning, anything like that, I'm always game for.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you're listening to this and you're a student athlete, you think your school could benefit from it. If you're an employee, you think your work could benefit from it. Or if you think you could just benefit yourself from, excuse me, from the knowledge that Brooke earned, right, and acquired and is really studied and immersed her life in. You heard it. You can get her personal line, which I think is, I mean, it just speaks volumes about what you're doing, Brooke, over
Thanks.
at your practice. I want to open up the floor to you, kind of turn it over to you for a minute or two. Is there anything we didn't chat about today that you think is super important for the mental health space, super important to you and close to your heart, or something that you just think? I guess our audience is primarily college and recent graduates. Is there anything for that space you think that would speak to us?
Yeah, kind of going back to one of the very first things you said when you said it wasn't necessarily a hot take anymore, that it's a more than a check mark, right? But the thing is, in our space, in the mental health space, yeah, we all know that, right? Like there's way more than a check mark. But in my opinion, the organizations, right, the teams that are hiring these professionals don't know that. So to them, it's still seen as this is a check mark, this is a requirement we have to meet. Some teams do a better job at integrating services, but I think that's worth highlighting, right? That, yeah, we all know the value of it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. But a lot of teams and organizations and decision makers still are cutting corners in terms of trying to find the like least amount of cost possible to meet the requirements of the league or the organization that they're in, and it is still unfortunately in a lot of environments seen as a check mark.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point, and the balance there is difficult because sometimes in order to get that top quality mental health service, you can't afford it, right? If you're a small business starting out, if you're a semi-pro
Hmm.
team, but the counter argument to that is you deserve it, your employees deserve it, and you shouldn't shortchange your mental and physical ability for a couple extra dollars if you have the privilege, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, checking that box is a fantastic place to start, right? You check the box and then realize, oh crap, we need to add three more underneath that. We need to add a subcategory, right?
Hmm.
Start, get the ball rolling. Take Brooke's bite-sized approach. If checking the box is all you can do, fantastic. I applaud you, but I really, really hope that anyone listening to this who is like, yeah, I checked the box, I'm a little guilty of that, just look into it a little more. Can you pour in $100 extra per employee, maybe? See what that gets. Just start
Hmm.
slow, and the results will speak for themselves, right? Again, in theory, your employees will be happier, your business will do better, and at the end of the day, they will thank you for it, right? Even if they don't use it right away, I guarantee it'll be at least one time that they'll even if they don't tell you, look into that
Hmm.
resource. So I appreciate that point, Brooke, of yeah, we know checking the box is fine, right? We know there's more than that, but you got to do the research yourself. So once you come to that conclusion, you already know where to find Brooke. I'll plug her one last time. She'll help you there. But Brooke, we appreciate your time today on the Make Mental podcast. Your insight has been incredibly valuable. I love this length episode. It was rapid fire questions. It was to the point. It was honest. And we have one last question for you that I know you'll answer honestly. So are you ready for the final question here, Brooke, on your episode of the podcast?
Absolutely.
All right. If there is one person in the entire world right now who could use a hug from you, who would you give it to and why?
I would give it to probably my daughter because she is going through such bad teething right now. She's just so sad all the time.
Uh,
So I would give it to my daughter, as cheesy as that is.
no, not cheesy at all. I love that response. And I always love the responses that our guests come up with because guests have given it to past versions of themselves, future versions of themselves, family members, friends, people they haven't thought about in years that they're going to send the episode to now. So I always love that response. And I think your daughter will receive the hug anyways. You'll probably go home and give her one regardless, but she'll receive another one here in spirit. So thank you for that. And again, I will put all the information we talked about in the website, all the matrices, Brooke's website, everything in the description. But give her a follow on social medias, right? It's free, right? That's more than checking the box. It's free. You can see what she's up to. So help her out there, and we will see you guys next time on the Make Mental podcast. Brooke, thank you one last time for joining us today.
Thank you so much for today. It was great.